like legally, constitutionally, you couldn't make an application to join an organization like NATO without including the entirety of the country, that is, the borders as we are recognized by the world, that is Ukraine. So your application, or rather your invitation, is for the entirety of Ukraine as we know it.
Well,
However,
including the
he says that
Donbass, including the Donbass?
Including the Donbass, including Crimea.
Wow.
But that's in the, if you like, in the process of becoming a NATO member. Clearly, this is where the discussion has been taking place with these various contacts in various governments. I understand that it's pretty widespread. They've been talking about it. In practice, they would expect and accept that the NATO protection would be provided for the areas currently controlled by Kyiv, President Zelensky, and that they wouldn't expect NATO, as of now, to go to war with Russia to gain back that other territory.
Now, just before I came on air, I managed to catch up with Stuart Ramsay, who did that interview with President Zelensky from Sky News. And he told me that he himself was actually surprised to hear Zelensky make this concession.
I basically go back to him again and ask him to confirm what he was saying. And it came not so much as a surprise, but I suppose perhaps an understanding that they've realised that if they want to get into some type of peace negotiation of some description, then they have to make some concession and perhaps put some more pressure onto President Putin. And again, I have to say, everything you see here, I believe, is in the context of the influence of the United States in many ways. Now, I understand that from a source who's close to the president's office but is not part of the president's office, that actually negotiations of some shape or form on this very topic have been going on for some time with the Biden administration. Now, they've accepted, the Ukrainian government has accepted now that is over with, and I think they're trying to position themselves for making similar appeals about NATO membership in return for accepting that Russia will hold some of their land for the time being to Donald Trump himself when he takes over. And we know from President Zelensky in that interview, he said some of his top people are going over to the United States soon to speak to Trump's people, and perhaps there'll be some developments. As I said, he was also saying that he hoped the war would end next year. But yes, I was actually surprised that he was so clear on this. As you say, because for so long, President Zelensky has said at no point will they stop, just hand over territory. He says they're still not handing over territory, but they will accept the Russians are there for the time being, and that they will move to have them out of the country with diplomacy over the years ahead.
And what's so interesting is that, even when we hear from Zelensky and we, speak to many different Ukrainian MPs on this station, and you do as well, and they have been very resolute, saying there is there's no talk of any ceasefire. We're fighting to the end, and we're fighting to win. That's been a very spirited, defiant stance, not just from Zelensky, but from other Ukrainian spokespeople. Do you think this has changed? Is it just because of Trump and a kind of political pragmatism? Is there also maybe some fatigue from the Ukrainian public as well?
Well, I think there's a fair amount of fatigue. Now, there's a couple of things there. Let me just go through this. Now, the polling, and it's not awfully accurate, but the polling shows that most people in Ukraine still believe that a ceasefire should, if agreed, and a peace, should have Russia outside of Ukrainian territory. That's what the polling says. But I've been speaking to an awful lot of people here, and they seem awfully tired. And many of them don't want to even admit this, but say they would quite like it just to come to an end under any circumstances. I went to a funeral today, yet another one of a senior commander who has been killed. And I was speaking to some of his men, and they were saying, we want to continue fighting. We're quite happy to carry on fighting. We will beat the Russians. However, if the president says that we're going to stop and that the land has to stay with Russia for the time being, we will take our orders. Now, it was inconceivable that any soldier would have said that a year or so ago, and nobody in private even was whispering, I wish it would just end, and perhaps we just got to accept that the Donbass area has gone to Russia. I was talking actually to a friend of mine here. He was saying, it's so long now and actually it's very easy to forget that this is actually 10 years this has been going on for, but it's so long that Donbass and the sort of Donetsk city and its areas around it has been taken over by the Russians. There's many people thinking like it sort of has gone. Anyone who's there now is probably identifying as a Russian anyway. So I think there's been that growing realization. And I think there's two other reasons for this, of course, from President Zelensky. One, they are running out of infantry at such an alarming rate that literally some of their trenches have nobody in it. They are defending them by drone pilots. There's no soldiers in some areas. They don't have enough weapons, and that's a big issue as to where has all these billions of dollars that's been promised by the United States, but also Great Britain and Europe. Where are all those weapons? And I think they're losing so many people that, as the president said, we're in danger of actually losing our nationhood. We're losing our society because the whole of the country is being destroyed. So maybe the calculation is that we just have to somehow find a way to bring this to an end, or at very real risk of actually losing the war properly. Not enough support coming from the outside, and Russia actually just advancing in and taking over Ukraine, which is what obviously President Putin wanted to do in the first place.
So let's move on to, how the shape of any sort of ceasefire could look like, given your interaction with Zelensky. What does he mean about the possibility of Ukrainian territory coming under a NATO umbrella? Does he mean full membership by that? What do you think he was alluding to?
Yes, so basically what he says is that, if you like, legally, constitutionally, you couldn't make an application to join an organization like NATO without including the entirety of the country, that is, the borders as we are recognized by the world, that is Ukraine. So your application, or rather your invitation, is for the entirety of Ukraine as we know it.
Well, however, including the Donbass, including the Donbass,
including Crimea.
Wow.
But that's in the, if you like, in the process of becoming a NATO member. Clearly, this is where the discussion has been taking place with these various contacts in various governments. I understand that it's pretty widespread. They've been talking about it. In practice, they would expect and accept that the NATO protection would be provided for the areas currently controlled by Kyiv, President Zelensky, and that they wouldn't expect NATO, as of now, to go to war with Russia to gain back that other territory. He says that's accepted, that that would be a negotiated deal via diplomacy over a later period. But any further movement by Russia, then they would expect to have that security shield that NATO gives. So from outside of the Donbass, for example, coming forward, if Russia was to push forward, then he would expect, or rather Kyiv government, Ukraine would expect that NATO allies would assist with any further attempted advances by the Russian military. So that's really what he was saying. If you like, there's a legal reason why it has to be the whole of the country, but they concede it is actually the only part of the country that would be protected by NATO would be that already is under the control of Kyiv.
And just to remind listeners, of course, the whole thing with NATO membership is an attack on one is an attack on all. So that's what the protection is. Now, would NATO be open to this suggestion?
They obviously, it's a suggestion and no offer has been made. And again, the president was actually keen, and his people were keen to point out that no offer has been made. Though, as I say, my understanding from a contact who's extremely well placed on international affairs told me that definitely they had been getting, they'd had good signs that something like this was being considered. As I say, my understanding it was the Biden administration, and in fact they expected there to be an announcement on it some time ago. But that's now they accept he's a lame duck and it's over with. I'm not sure how many of the NATO countries will sign up. It would have to be all of them. But again, the advice seems to be that if some of the big ones, and that's the United States, obviously the biggest, perhaps then Germany and Britain, and certainly France as well, if they were to indicate a support for it, then you can probably bring the others on board. But I think we're quite a long way from that, although I've also understand that meetings with Europe, perhaps then with NATO, will happen. Remember that they have meetings. Ukrainian government and Defence Department have meetings with NATO on a regular basis because, of course, although we're talking about NATO perhaps stepping up and doing more to potentially protect a NATO member, they're already doing a huge amount. It's just they're done on bilateral arrangements with all the various countries, and it's sort of united and organised. But the point is, it's not quite the same as NATO, and the security shield that it gives isn't in place. So the feeling amongst advisors to the president is that we have lots of bilateral deals, but they don't come to much when push really comes to shove. And they think that NATO gives them that extra protection. But of course, we have seen in the past that NATO does have this: if you do anything to us, we'll attack you back. It hasn't been tested an awful lot, but there is a sort of working feeling, if you like, for want of a better expression, that actually, if, for example, Russia was to go into one of the Baltic countries, and take a couple of villages, would NATO immediately go to war with Russia? There is an awful lot of people who doubt that would actually be the case.
And how do you think this is going to be received in America? Is this going to be claimed as a victory for Trump as the incoming president? You know, he was saying that if I win, I'm going to get these guys around the table, I'm going to stop the fighting. Is he going to sort of feel quite pleased about this?
Well, I think it's interesting that they definitely intend to frame this as a potential win for Trump, and to show that he is powerful, that he's facing down Putin, he's got the support of Ukraine, he's got the support of NATO in it, and he can show that America is back on the block, as it were. That's how they're going to frame it. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. He may come to office, some of his advisors certainly feel like this, and say, I tell you what, you're just going to go and talk to to the Russians, whether you like it or not, or you won't have any weapons, and then they'll win, and you're going to allow them to keep the land they've got. He could easily take that view. Conversely, he could actually say to Putin, if you don't do some type of deal and stop this fighting, we're going to actually arm Ukraine to the teeth and assist them to push you out. So the problem for everyone involved in this, Putin and Zelensky, they've no idea what Trump is going to do. The
unpredictability of Trump. And how do you think this is going to be received in Moscow?
I think I can't imagine that President Putin wouldn't be anything but apoplectic at the thought that Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO. It's been one of the big things that they've been talking about for absolutely years. And the view has always been that while Ukraine wants to join NATO and Russia doesn't, then you're never going to get them talking on any other potential subject that could lead to a ceasefire. However, we don't know the power of President Trump, and we don't know whether Putin is bluffing a lot of the time, which of course he has drawn all sorts of red lines for Ukraine to cross, and for example long-range weapons that are provided by the United States and Britain, and the reaction hasn't been that bad. It's not been sort of game-changingly ferocious at the attacks here. So you don't know whether Putin, to a degree, may be persuaded into some sort of discussion. Economically, Russia is suffering from all the sanctions, so it's no means plain sailing for him. But I think as it stands now, because of the battlefield gains he's making in the Donbass region, they really, they are gaining territory all the time there from the Ukrainians. He would come to any argument in a much stronger place than certainly President Zelensky is.
Gosh, it's so fascinating, isn't it? This interaction between Trump, Zelensky and Putin is just going to be so fascinating to see how that plays out. And just final question to Stuart, you've been following this so closely, you've been, close up with all the main players. In your gut, do you think we are going to get to a ceasefire anytime soon?
I don't know anytime soon, but I do feel that the president and the president's office of Ukraine, that is, wouldn't have made these comments if there wasn't something in it and an inkling that they might get it might be well received in some quarters, and those quarters have indicated that is the case. That, or it's a bit of a wild card hope that they sort of prod someone into some action, but they definitely need more help. I mean, regardless of whether it involves joining NATO or not, they can't hold on as they are, because they just need more weapons, because there's a finite number of men they can call up, but they can get more weapons, and that supply is something that they're already asking for and saying we need these as soon as possible, regardless of any discussion. But President Zelensky has indicated a number of times before that he thinks it'll end next year. And of course, Donald Trump has said he is determined that it's going to come to an end. So maybe, but it might not be a peace that both sides like. But we just don't know whether it's a peace they might just be able to swallow and accept. That's the key, I think, to this.
That was Stuart Ramsay from Sky News, who sat down with President Zelensky. What a fascinating interview, and what a fascinating development. What do you think this is going to mean? Chris, one of our listeners, has messaged in saying he thinks this is a gambit to win over Trump, to outmaneuver Putin. But Putin would never accept it for negotiation in terms of that full NATO membership. Well, this is going to be so interesting to see how this pans out. And